Why don't you talk a little bit about what you were going to mention before about reification and about whiteness? Go ahead.
Yeah, so I can tie this into my alternative uh, as well. So, in a sense, basically, reification is the idea that you make an abstraction, such as whiteness, into a real thing, a concrete thing. Other examples would be like saying, like, the universe is indifferent or something like that. That always comes to mind for Mad Men. But the issue, uh, logically speaking, technically, it's a fallacy of misplaced concreteness. An abstraction cannot take on a material existence. Now, typically, we understand reification metaphorically. It sort of makes sense, so to speak, to say the universe is indifferent or whatever. So, in that sense, people use the notion of reification all the time. So you see references in the literature to what reified whiteness, the reification of whiteness. Beyond, Cheryl Harris's paper in 1993 in the Harvard Law Review, reifying whiteness through legal means and so on. But it's fallacious. Like, um, you don't, an abstraction does not become concrete. But
Is that their
I,
argument?
yeah, I mean, so when you say something is reified, it effectively becomes your argument. But as
But do
I
you think
said,
that's what they're really trying to say?
well, as I said, it's typically understood metaphorically. And
Right.
so what you're really trying to say is that, and this is going to lead me to my alternative. So what the problem I view is that whiteness as an abstraction becomes a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And there's a paper back in like '01 by a historian, Eric Arsenault, I think, whatever. Basically summarized it as whiteness has become a blank screen onto which people project their own interpretations and so on. And that kind of gets you into the problems of confirmation bias, omitted variable bias, and so on, negativity bias, so on. Now, what I can get behind, and this leads me, is I mentioned Cheryl Harris's very famous 1993 Harvard Law Review paper about on whiteness as property.
Hmm.
Uh, and so what I developed is this notion, and it's drawing on Harris's paper and to some extent Ian Haney Lopez's book, White by Law, which is that, you know, whiteness has been institutionalized in the sense that whatever it means, and this is where, it's meant different things as history has progressed. Obvious examples being like, Italians were not necessarily considered white. Irish were not necessarily considered white when they first came here. And the whole process of them being integrated as white, so to speak. So whiteness is a kind of public property that you possess by virtue of having quote unquote white skin. Now, economists understand property as the right to make use of a resource. And in this case, the resource would be the advantages associated with being white, whether it's legal protections or whether it's just being accepted in, all the different ways that you can imagine being accepted in society, essentially white privilege. So that's what whiteness as property gives rise to, is white privilege. Now, then the question is, what is white privilege? And I argue for a refined understanding of what white privilege is. Like, you really have to understand what we actually mean by it. So go to the source, Peggy McIntosh's famous paper, and she draws a distinction further later taken up by a philosopher named Lawrence Blum, a distinction between privileges that are worth having and privileges that are not worth having. That is, privileges that are kind of like rights, like the idea that you're not going to get stopped by a cop with greater probability, right? Like, white people are still stopped by the cops, but perhaps with less probability than, say, black, that who's not speeding. And so those are not privileges. Is sort of those are not privileges we want to take away from there, like basic rights. This is coming from Lewis Gordon. Historically, these privileges that are worth having have been restricted to white people by virtue of having white skin. It's been a kind of right associated with the public property of being white. And so they've been like club goods, which is what economists call them, club goods, as opposed to public goods. So privileges worth having are like public goods. In other words, everybody should have them, just like national defense, just like clean air, um, anything you can think of as public goods.
Hmm.
So then you want to distinguish that from privileges not worth having, unjust enrichment. White person is exonerated for the crime he committed, and a black person is found guilty for the crime that he didn't commit. Then white guilty guy is unjustly enriched. Maybe because there's a biased white jury and all sorts of other reasons that you can think about. So those are privileges that are not worth having. And this all arises from the institutionalization of quote unquote whiteness as property. And what whiteness as property does in giving rise to these privileges is it makes privileges that are worth having in privileges that are restricted to white people, namely club goods. I won't get into the economic theory of that for now, as opposed to public goods. And so then I kind of developed how we go about making these public goods for everybody and not just club goods for white people. Then there's the issue of public bads, which is the privileges not worth having. But you want to get rid of public goods. You want to minimize the probability of unjust enrichment and stuff like that. I get into tort harms and so on. But the basic idea I'm trying to get at is I can get behind, it's tangible to me. Maybe it's because I'm an economist by training, but it makes sense to think about whiteness as a form of public property that gives rise to public goods, privileges that are worth having, basic rights that everybody needs to have, and public bads that unjustly have enriched white people at the expense of non-white people throughout history that we want to minimize, get rid of. I can get behind that. That's what I can understand. And then, then you have to get into the whole analysis of how whiteness has changed over time and what it's meant legally and culturally and so on. And those are very, very complex conversations that are part of what you and I are doing and what other people are doing. Get into notions of cultural racism, colorblind racism, and all of that. And I don't want to sort of spiral out of control here, but that's the sort of alternative framework that I am developing. I sort of develop it a little bit more at length in chapter 10 of the book, but I can understand whiteness as a form of public property. But reification, logically, technically speaking, is a fallacy. That said, I understand it's more metaphorical, but in practice, it becomes problematic to the extent that if whiteness is just whatever any particular person is thinking it is at any particular time, as Eric Arsenin was saying, a blank screen onto which people project their own meanings, then you have an ambiguous term to which we attribute racial inequality. It sort of anthropomorphizes society. It anthropomorphizes whiteness as some nefarious force working its way like a thread through every part of society. And it gives rise to all sorts of ambiguities that I find very problematic. But we'd have to work that out in particular individual situations.
Okay. So it's interesting that the public bad that you thought about was unjust enrichment.
Well, that's Lawrence Brum's term. That's his way of formulating.
Okay. So, and it's interesting that under the privileges worth having or the club goods, you went to being stopped by the police.
Well, he talks about it in terms of being spared injustice. So these are just the terms. I'm bringing it. This is from a paper by a moral philosopher who's kind of he specializes in race stuff. And so
I mean, it just sounds like another way of saying the exact same thing. I'm trying to figure out what the benefit is of changing the framework. Do you think it's a little more less blame ridden somehow? Do you think it's a little more innocuous?
I just think it makes more sense economically, because then I can talk about how I can talk about it in terms of marginal benefits and marginal costs and public goods and goods. I worked this out in chapter 10. But the idea of whiteness as a form of public property, a kind of public good, is just something that I think makes sense to me.
What do you think about what in your mind is the origin of whiteness?
Yeah, I couldn't tell you that.
Yeah, you definitely need to research that because that will change your whole perspective on what you're
no,
saying.
no. So no. So I mean, I'm not unaware of different accounts uh, of the origin of whiteness. I mentioned one book in particular, uh, Ian Haney Lopez's White by Law, which traces the development of whiteness in the United States. Basically, I guess back to 1790 with the first definition of a citizen. Kendi, of course, goes back to the 16th century and doesn't necessarily specifically talk about whiteness, more in terms of anti-blackness. And you can talk about this conceptually from a philosophical perspective, because a lot of the whiteness literature in terms of these hierarchical binaries arise out of sort of post-structuralist lingo, particularly things like Derrida or what have you. And so you can't define white without defining black. And,
Exactly. I mean, you don't agree with that?
I'm not saying right now that I agree or disagree with them. What I'm saying now is in terms of trying to, as you asked, identify the origins of the concept.
Well, hang on though. Okay, like I do want to know whether you agree or disagree with that because I think that's the crux of it.
Yeah, I'm just saying there's a question about what it means to disagree. I mean, again, this is just me being philosophical. I can't help it. But like, for instance, if you want to talk about Kendi's thesis, where you can trace racism and racist policy back to Prince Henry of Portugal, and he writes about Serrara, the biographer of Henry, and producing racist ideas to justify racist policies and what have you. And I think it's important. For instance, I suppose if you agree with Kendi, that's where whiteness begins. I mean, I don't know. I haven't done that independent analysis myself, but like one thing that comes to mind when I read his analysis is like, to state the obvious, slavery and everything that followed and all that is obviously, horrific tragedy and all that. The ideas, but the idea that you would produce racist ideas specifically to justify what Kendi calls a racist policy or slavery or whatever. I'm not convinced that it goes one way like that. And the reason I say that is, in the 16th century, you're dealing with different dimensions of space and time. It takes months to get on a ship and go from England to Africa. Nobody knows about things like DNA or modern biology or whatever. So the idea that you would, quote unquote, other people from a far off land, that you would think of them as different in these sort of essentialized ways that you find in this literature. I mean, it's obviously wrong, but it doesn't strike me as surprising from the perspective of just human psychology in a different dimension of space and time, as I'm saying it right now, just because of what people knew. And then, of course, the fact that they had technology to exploit things, that they did. But the idea of whiteness in relation to blackness could arise simply from a time in history in which encountering people hundreds of miles away, different skin color, different country or cultures and different ways of life is a far more jarring experience than it would be today, and can give rise to all sorts of racist ideas that then give rise to racist policies. So to me, I can see the interplay working both ways.
But what do you mean by that? Both ways being what?
That racist ideas can give rise to racist policies.
Oh.
In addition to the other way around.
Oh yeah, no, I completely agree with that. In fact, I think it's very problematic that we're not thinking about it like that.
Well, I bring that up because basically Kendi's view is that it always starts with policy.
Yeah, and I think that that's a big problem. And I also don't really understand it, given he wrote a book with the subheading "The Origin of Racist Ideas in America," but then he thinks it's policy that dictates racism. So I find that to be very weird. Um, and actually, I've run into a lot of black academics who believe that, and I've had a lot of discussions about that. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that it does go both ways in that sense.
And I guess real briefly, the other point, the notion of hierarchical binaries. I mean, sure, it makes sense, but it's something that, to my mind, without having done, more thought on this, it's something that arises from sort of conceptual developments in postmodern or post-structuralist philosophy, and isn't necessarily something that was, to go back to unconscious, that was people conscious stuff in the 16th century. But maybe the idea.
I mean, if you read their writings, it's pretty conscious.
Oh, I mean, yeah,
like,
yeah.
it's pretty much out there.
No, but I mean, what for them, it's like, yeah. I mean, I get what you're saying, but in the way that modern critical theory understands it and is trying to conceptualize it, something happening then in today's terms, I have to think all of that through. But yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, the notion of hierarchical binaries, it is coherent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, so, would you agree then that in America, because of our history with slavery and how that relates to the binary that you were just talking about, that it kind of took on a new dimension here because of the level of dehumanization that was kind of connected to the superiority of white people?
I mean, it was awful.
Yeah, but like, I mean, I guess my point is generations of that, right? And then just do you believe that
Yeah.
it's possible that that could have created a situation where it's entrenched in people's kind of psyches?
Yeah, that reminds me of a distinction I almost forgot to make, which is, and I do, and I write about it, in about sort of attitudes in the 19th century, burrowing their way into the attitudes of subsequent generations and so on. But I distinguish between racism and the legacy of racism. So I really do. I mean, I can understand what people are trying to get at with the notion of systemic racism, but I still adhere to the idea that racism really is refers to prejudice, direct prejudice against people for whatever on the basis of gender, ethnicity, race, or whatever, and then that prejudice gives rise to systems of hierarchy and power and so on that then evolve and change over time. And
Yeah,
we've
but
obviously made,
what gives rise to prejudice?
well, I mean, that's another, I mean,
I
we
mean,
were
I
kind
think
of
that's
talking,
critical.
yeah,
Like
yeah. So I
that's
mean,
the real issue. It's not the rest of it.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah. I mean, and I don't claim to have the answer to this. I don't think that,
I think you probably
I
do have the
no,
answer.
no, no, no. What I mean by I don't have definitive answers to this. Like, or it really depends on the nature of the question. But like, this is the point of the Kendi critique that I was writing, which is that there's this endogeneity issue. Like, that's what sort of economists or social sciences say, where you develop a model and there are these interrelationships between the dependent. You're a math. That's right. You're a math. You
I
know this.
am.
So the dependent and independent they can reciprocal relations, and you have omitted variables in the error term and so on. And so you have these constant interplays. And so you can envision policies having leading to inequalities that then themselves give rise to racist ideas, and you can see it working the other way as well. So I mean, when I say I don't know, I mean any particular issue you have to. I mean, it can work both ways, and I mean I don't know. I mean, it's conceivable to me. Yes, uh, you know, you can have these structured systems in place that then give rise to racist ideas and prejudice, then reinforce the social structured systems of. But I guess my starting point is that racism is um, what D'Angelo calls the good bad, the good bad binary. And I think the reason why it's important to keep that distinction in mind is that it allows us to distinguish between racism and the legacy of racism, and working out what the legacy of racism is itself, a whole other conversation. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. So I guess the issue is that racial inequality, Kendi says, when I see racial disparities, I see racism. And what he has in mind is he's talking about policies, has this notion of systemic racism and so on. And I'm not convinced that it's simply monocausal. There's, like just simple examples like, the fact that there are an overrepresentation of Black NBA players and an underrepresentation of Black Major League Baseball players. Like this is just the whole cultural stuff where, you can talk about JJ Redick talking about his experience in AAU basketball. It was an overwhelmingly Black culture. And it just, I don't know if the reason there are more Black players in the NBA is simply because it's more popular in Black culture. It's a reasonable hypothesis, but I don't necessarily see that as necessarily as evidence of racism or prejudice against, I don't know, I guess it would be prejudice against white people or whatever. And similarly, I don't know that I see the underrepresentation of white or Black players in Major League Baseball as necessarily evidence of prejudice against Black people. Just an example. So, you have to just work all this out. So I don't necessarily see disparity as itself evidence of racism.
Well, it's because you're defining racism as prejudice.
That's right.
That's why. That's the reason. So, if you look racism up in the dictionary, then it's going to talk about belief. It's going to talk about thought, because that's the origin of racism.
Yeah, implicit in my understanding here is that these biases or prejudices originate from some kind of belief, however much they might be formed, and it may simply, that most certainly would, you would think, be formed in part from where you grow up in, your sort of environmental influences. Sure.
Yeah.
I don't think we should deny any of that. Sure.
Here's what I think people are denying. I think what people are denying is that when you say, for instance, that there are all these variables and all these factors that we need to consider, right, in addition to race, I think a lot of people think that you can kind of parse those out. But that's not a realistic perspective, because race touches any other perspective, any other factor that you're going to name. So there's a relationship between race and any other factor you could think of, whether it's culture, whether it's where you live, whether it's whatever. It all touches race, and it all has a history, a racial history. So I'm not really sure what, this is my struggle. When people are always trying to parse out the different factors and basically say, oh, we can't tell, what is what. It's like the reason people talk about race and racism as being so all encompassing is because it literally is. That's the way it operates. That's the way it functions. So, it's very difficult. Who for us, I guess there's not really a purpose to parsing it out, because we know that at any different category we're going to look at, it's going to have a relationship to racism.
So two things. One, there's a, well, let me say this one first. I think it's just easy to get out of the way, which is the one problem that comes to mind, where I get uneasy about that is and it's not just racism, but with D'Angelo, and this maybe just might reflect her more dogmatic approach, but her social justice book, she talks about how, whenever you're watching a film or listening to music or whatever, you should always be thinking about what kinds of hierarchies are being, always stop and think about what kinds of things, hierarchies are being reinforced, whatever. And it just makes you think that I'm never going to be able to just stop and watch a movie again, And maybe that's just the way it comes across with D'Angelo, but at some point, and I don't think this is what you're saying, but sometimes it becomes like that for people who are so like my sister sometimes, but everything gets filtered through this crusader type lens, and that's when I get just uneasy. But the other point I wanted to make was there's a book called, which I think is one of the better books on all of this, which is called White Logic, White Methods. And it's a book of essays. One of the main points that comes up, which I think is a good point, which is just that the meaning of the word race has changed over time. So when you look at statistical studies of racial inequality or anything else, you have to be aware of the fact that the variable that you're isolating, either as a causal or dependent variable, that you're not necessarily measuring the same thing through time. So race is itself conceptually evolving, or does it make sense to even have race as a census indicator? You have sort of different.
I think it's all beside the point. Race never made sense, right? From the minute it was established, it didn't make sense. So everything that follows doesn't make sense either.
So from the standpoint right now, in December 8, 2020, I fully agree. Like if I could just get rid of the notion of race as something completely nonsensical, I would. Obviously, we can't because it's baked into so many things. But at the same time, like we were saying, I can see why people would. I don't see it as like a cabal. I don't know that I see some small people in a room saying, let's make up this term to create a hierarchy for the next 3 centuries. It worked out that way. But
we're 100% sure that happened.
Well, look, the biographer of Prince Henry, as Kendi writes, concocted all these ideas about the inferiority of people on Africa and why we need to do this and that, whatever, and then so on and so on. But it's also the case that Prince Henry was exploring the world for a whole lot of other reasons. And, it's not that, but so, if you want to say that, race itself was constructed in order to justify, and and it doesn't make sense because race is not real. But again, nobody knows about DNA back then, nobody knows about, so the idea that people would essentialize race, well, obviously it's nonsensical. You could have essentialized people in any number of ways, I assume. I'm not I don't want to. I guess I should stop because I don't want to say something that I haven't thought through and then regret what I'm saying. Because the essential point is race never made sense.
Right.
And I agree with that. And if we could get rid of the notion of race, we can't. I would, but obviously we can't because here we are 400 or 500 years later.
Well, I think that's the end game, right?
I'm on board with that, but then working out details and nuances, that's what these conversations are about.
Definitely, yeah, but I do think that's the end game is to get rid of it. That is the end game.
Well, except for D'Angelo, who says it's all a lifelong process and it'll never end.
Well, I don't think the lifelong process that she's talking about there, I think the lifelong process she's talking about is understanding it, right? A lot of people have no idea that race is a fabricated social construction. A lot of people do not know that. They do not think about it ever, right? And we're not teaching it to people, right? We're not teaching people that is true. So people are just coming up with their own ideas, and it's not a natural thing for people to conclude that race is made up, right? Because it's everywhere. It's literally everywhere. So why would anyone believe that if no one explains it, right? So, and we know for sure that there have been huge efforts to stop people from explaining it, even, down to President Trump's executive order, right? Just a few months ago. So I think that,
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I just think I feel like I should put a word on that. That the idea that we're teaching the idea of race as a social construct in the way that we're talking about, I'm fine with that. But I think what people were objecting to with the critical race theory trainings were sort of the way that you know that the way that it was being taught in terms of, like I think about the example of the African American History Museum, where you have a chart showing objectivity and paying your bills or whatever as sort of manifestations of whiteness and so on. And I think that people also have a lot of problems with the notion of white privilege and so on. And rightfully so, which is why I try to articulate a very refined concept of it, because I do think there is something called white privilege, but what it is very, very controversial and it's not necessarily clear. And then, you can think of examples like when all of this training was implemented in New York City schools under Richard Carranza a few years ago. And so I think it's rightfully a very sensitive topic. And I think critical race theory, we can talk about that some other time, but I do have objections to, like the Derek Bell approach to critical race theory, and intersectionality is a useful concept in many ways, but it also has problems. So I do think there are objections that can be erased. And I, as much as like it was embarrassing to watch Trump in the debate defend his decision. I mean, he has absolutely no idea what he's talking about, obviously. But it's just so unfortunate that he became the mouthpiece for that. But I mean, if we're just talking about trying to understand race as a social construct in the way that we're talking about, I mean, yes, I agree. But I do think there are a lot of people are expressing reasonable concerns about those trainings and where they're carried out.
Yeah, I think that this is the problem, right? We cherry pick trainings that are extreme. That is definitely a thing that has happened. 100%.
I'd be
There are
interested
all
in.
kinds of different things that people are trying to do out there to try to explain race. And they found the worst examples, the
That may
most
very well
extreme.
be.
I happen to know it's true because I looked into it. But like I'm telling you,
Tell
this
me
is
more. Tell me
well,
more.
I mean, that's the story, right? You could go look into it. You could find a bunch of different trainings that people offer. You can look at the content of those trainings, and what you'll find is that the kind of blame and shaming that is done in some of them, the kind of discussion about white responsibility or white guilt, it is not prevalent in the trainings overall.
Well,
And
so that's reassuring.
yeah, and unfortunately, what continues to happen, which is something that has happened time and time again, is that the same thing happened with Black Lives Matter, right? Like Black Lives Matter now is something that people view pretty negatively, right? But like it's the exactly Hashish 2020, it's the sensationalism, right? And when you sensationalize something that is already a sensitive subject, like you've mentioned several times, then people are going to jump to conclusions, and then it's going to be really difficult to unravel those conclusions. And then, especially when there are powerful people with large mouthpieces who it's beneficial for them to push those false conclusions. And they can do that, without any consequence, and it's very effective. And this
Well,
is something that's happened over and over and over again.
I would like to. I mean, so I mean, I'm thinking of just just example out of example. I mean, I can just thinking of a Facebook post by somebody from high school at one point talking about how she was proud of a kid who told her teacher that who checked her teacher's privilege by saying, that you can't be racist towards white people because it's you can only be prejudiced, but you can't be racist, which is funny because Kendi would disagree. So he's like,
I actually do agree with that,
yeah,
because
well,
there
I
is a
disagree.
difference.
Yeah, I mean,
It's about superiority and
yeah.
inferiority.
So I get the prejudice plus power thing, but
That's not what I mean when I say it. I'm talking about the idea of an inferiority superiority complex. That is the nature of racism. And
yeah,
so
the hierarchy. I mean, I get it.
right, so when you're being prejudiced against someone and you're not invoking that hierarchy, then I don't think you can really call it racism.
I mean, I think that there's somewhat of an implied hierarchy in any kind of prejudice because you're assuming
No way.
a bias because of. I mean, we can agree to disagree at this point. I mean, I'd be happy to work through it at some point, but yeah, I can't agree with that. I myself wouldn't agree with that. So anyway, the point being was that I think of these instances, but what I really like to see is actually a real systematic collection of data on and somehow being able to quantify what is more or less sensitive of a training and so on. I think that it's becoming more and more well established that implicit bias trainings, for instance, don't really work very well. Somewhat separate issue, but I'd be interested in knowing more like the aggregate data.
Yeah. And some people in the chat have like kind of chimed in on that. Some people have been in corporate, it sounds like, and seen both sides of it, right? Things more like, the conversation that we're having, and things that are more like the, re-education of white people type situation, right? Which is difficult because it's actually a thing that needs to happen. Like if you look at the situation, honestly, then the white community as a whole does not understand racism. And that is the
Well,
problem. That is a huge part of the problem. Like central to the problem.
I mean, yeah, I'm hesitant to agree, but it's very dependent on exactly, we've sort of been having this conversation. I mean, it's part of the whole conversation that we've been having. But because I mean, depending on the nature of the precepts I can agree or I can't disagree, but D'Angelo talks explicitly about, consciousness raising and so on. And those are the types of trainings that I would avoid, that I wouldn't want to be a part of.
Me either, man. I'm with you. We agree on that.
Thanks for watching. For access to the full-length conversation and all of the 2-hour-long unedited conversations that I've had on race, click the support link in the description below. Thanks for your support and see you next time.